Warning: the following program contains subject matter that may be disturbing to some audiences. Viewer discretion advised. You're listening to Descent to Depravity, where we investigate the darkest corners of the human psyche, one chilling story at a time. Night presses down on Northwest Fort Lauderdale like a weight, thick with humidity and the stale smell of stagnant water. In a weed-choked lot behind a small neighborhood church, two patrol officers stand in the glow of their flashlights, their voices dropping to whispers as if afraid to disturb something lurking in the dark. What brought them here is a call from a group of kids who had been playing in the field, kids who thought they'd found a pile of old clothes until one of them kicked the mound and realized it wasn't cloth at all. A detective kneels in the mud, his gloved hands trembling slightly as he lifts back a torn sheet of plastic. Beneath it lies the decomposing body of a young woman, half buried, her limbs twisted unnaturally in the dirt. It is a scene this neighborhood has seen before. It will see it again. For more than a decade, a predator has been moving through these streets, walking the same alleys where children play, passing the same storefront churches where families gather on Sundays, stalking the same abandoned lots where bodies now appear. Women vanish at night, and days later their remains turn up in fields behind bars, near railroad tracks, or in overgrown churchyards. The attacks follow a hauntingly familiar pattern: assault in a sexual manner, asphyxia, and disposal in the same tight cluster of blocks. Detectives whisper about it privately, but the people living here have already named him. To the women who survive him, the men who hustle on the corners, and the children who grow up hearing rumors, he is simply the predator. But what the neighborhood doesn't know is that while this predator hunts freely, the justice system is locking up the wrong men. One of them, Frank Lee Smith, is arrested, convicted, and sentenced to death for the sexual battery and murder of 8-year-old Chandra Whitehead, a crime he insists he did not commit. He repeats his innocence at every hearing, but no one believes him. After 14 years on death row, he dies in a prison hospital, still protesting. Only after his death does DNA reveal the horrifying truth. The real killer had been alive the entire time, walking the streets of Fort Lauderdale while Smith wasted away in a concrete cell. Another man, Jerry Frank Townsend, intellectually disabled and functioning at the level of a child, is interrogated for hours by detectives who feed him details of murders he knows nothing about. Confused and terrified, he eventually confesses to more than 20 killings. He spends 22 years in prison for the crimes of someone else, and yet, even as Townsend sits in a cage and Smith dies proclaiming innocence, the bodies in Northwest Fort Lauderdale keep appearing, because the man responsible for them has never been stopped. Detectives who chase the truth describe this predator in chilling terms. Some call him worse than Bundy, worse than Gacy, not because his methods are showier or more theatrical, but because of something far more unsettling. He lives among his victims. He blends into the neighborhood. He walks the streets every day like a harmless wanderer, a familiar face that no one pays attention to, except the women who fear him and the detectives who know, deep down, he is the one leaving bodies in the dirt. He is not a drifter. He doesn't flee when things heat up. He returns home every night and sleeps a few blocks from the scenes of his crimes. His name is Eddie Lee Mosley, and for nearly 20 years, Fort Lauderdale learned what happens when a predator stalks a forgotten neighborhood, and the system that should have stopped him not only failed, but condemned innocent men in his place. Northwest Fort Lauderdale in the 1970s was a neighborhood suspended between the promise of community and the weight of neglect. Small, weathered homes sat in tight rows along narrow streets like Northwest 15th Avenue and 27th Avenue, their porches sagging under Florida humidity. Corner stores were fortified behind metal grates. The neighborhood churches stood tall, their steeples rising over rusted chain-link fences and vacant lots thick with overgrowth. In the evenings, children played under flickering streetlights, darting between abandoned houses and cracked sidewalks. It was a place where residents relied on one another for survival, because the city, by and large, did not. And in the middle of this overlooked landscape, the earliest bodies began appearing. This community, dense, isolated, and largely ignored by city leadership, became the hunting ground for a predator who moved silently through its streets. Detectives would later observe that nearly every woman found dead in this era was discovered within a 1-mile radius of 1048 Northwest 27th Avenue, the home of a man most neighbors barely noticed. The dump sites formed a rough circle around his house, fields behind churches, alleyways near corner stores, and patches of grass where children cut through to get home from school. When the murders were finally mapped, investigators admitted with a shudder that the epicenter of the violence was Mosley's front doorstep. Eddie Lee Mosley grew up in this neighborhood. Born in 1947, raised in poverty, and marked early by profound intellectual disabilities the school system could neither accommodate nor understand. Teachers documented that he could not keep up with the simplest lessons. He failed repeatedly, eventually leaving school around the 2nd grade. Psychological evaluations later measured his IQ at around 52, placing him deep within the range of severe impairment. In court documents and doctor's notes, he was labeled mentally retarded, then developmentally disabled, then no longer a threat, depending on who was tasked with handling him. Those labels would change often over the decades, but the danger he posed did not. He drifted through his days performing odd jobs, cutting yards, sweeping porches, hauling scrap, moving through the same blocks where his victims lived, worked, and eventually died. From childhood onward, he was described as strange, slow, unpredictable. Women said he stared too long, followed too closely, whispered inappropriate things when he thought no one was listening. Men on the corners dismissed him as off, an oddball who wandered at all hours. But to Fort Lauderdale homicide detective Doug Evans, who would spend nearly 20 years chasing him, Mosley was something far more chilling. Evans later said, "I know him better than anybody else in the world. This guy is definitely a murderer." Evans recognized a pattern in the disappearances long before anyone else was willing to say the word serial. The earliest homicides tied to Mosley stretch back to the early 1970s. In November 1972, the body of an unidentified woman was found near the New River and railroad tracks, not far from where Mosley later lived. She had been subdued by pressure to her neck. In July 1973, 34-year-old Vetta Turner was discovered at 626 Northwest 22nd Road. Her killing bore the same signature: assaulted in a sexual manner, followed by ligature-fatal neck compressions. On the morning of July 20, 1973, the quiet stretch of Northwest Fort Lauderdale hid a horror waiting to be found. 15-year-old Naomi Gamble had been seen alive just after 9:30 a.m., walking through the neighborhood the way she had countless times before. 3 hours later, her body was discovered deep in the dense underbrush off the 2400 block of Northwest 15th Court, hidden beneath tangled vines and shadows thick enough to swallow a person whole. Officers pushed through the brush and found Naomi nude from the waist down, wearing only a red halter top. The medical examiner later determined that she had been sexually assaulted and subjected to fatal neck compression, a pattern that mirrored the violence already beginning to haunt the Northwest Corridor. She had been taken in broad daylight, attacked, and left in a patch of tangled growth less than a mile from where children played and families moved through their day, unaware of the danger creeping through their streets. Shortly after, the body of 21-year-old Barbara Ann Brown was discovered by a young child, hidden behind bushes in a debris-strewn lot between the Triangle Bar and the Madison Apartments in the 2500 block of Northwest 8th Street. Investigators determined she had been sexually assaulted and died by asphyxiation, clothing scattered and personal items found several feet away. Witnesses reported hearing screams in the early morning, and detectives quickly noted her case matched a growing pattern of women in the same area who had been attacked and left in isolated lots throughout Northwest Fort Lauderdale. For nearly 2 years, between November 1971 and July 1973, a terror moved through Northwest Fort Lauderdale, with a speed and boldness that left the community paralyzed. Close to 150 women and girls reported being cornered, dragged, or coerced into the desolate pockets of the neighborhood, where no one could hear them call out. Each survivor described the same figure: a tall young man, athletic, broad-shouldered, dark-skinned, marked by a faint scar carved into his left cheek. He threatened them with violence, forced them into isolation, then sexually assaulted them, often after cutting off their air with his hands until they could no longer resist. By the summer of 1973, fear had become the neighborhood's second shadow. On July 23, 1973, 3 survivors, unrelated, unknown to one another, pointed to the same man in a police lineup, Eddie Lee Mosley. His height, build, and that small cut on his cheek matched the composite sketch almost too perfectly. Once Mosley was arrested, detectives began showing his photograph to other survivors. The response was overwhelming. More than 40 women identified him as the man who had attacked them. Behind closed doors, investigators whispered that Mosley was likely responsible for even more violence than the official tally suggested, and Mosley was considered the prime suspect. But without solid physical evidence, prosecutors played it safe. They charged him only with the assaults and 1 additional sexual battery. Then came the psychological evaluation. Doctors concluded that Eddie Lee Mosley was legally insane, unfit for trial, and incapable of understanding the proceedings against him. Instead of facing a courtroom, he was sent to the Florida State Hospital, committed involuntarily for treatment. He remained there for 5 years, and during the entire span of Mosley's confinement, those long, quiet years locked inside a mental institution, not a single similar assault or killing occurred in Northwest Fort Lauderdale. It was as though the city exhaled, and the darkness stepped back into its cage. On February 1, 1979, Eddie Lee Mosley was moved to the South Florida State Hospital in Pembroke Pines. He completed a 5-month course of psychiatric treatment, and by that summer, doctors determined he was no longer a danger to society. They released him with the requirement that he continue therapy as an outpatient, checking in with a psychiatrist at the Henderson Mental Health Clinic in Southwest Fort Lauderdale. After his release, Mosley quietly returned to his parents' home, slipping back into the same neighborhood that had once lived in fear of him. Mosley's violence resurfaced with chilling speed. On July 20, 1979, Kathy Moore's body was discovered near a lake by Dillard High School. Medical examiners later determined she had died from forced airway restriction and had been violated before her death. Only a week later, on July 27, 1979, neighborhood children stumbled upon the body of 13-year-old Sonia Marion inside a small abandoned building behind the Dillard High football field at 2501 Northwest 11th Street. She had suffered devastating head trauma, a cinder block left beside her, as well as the same pattern of assault seen in earlier victims. Then, on August 7, 1979, the violence struck again. 21-year-old Terry Jean Cummings was attacked and left lifeless just yards from her own home, continuing a streak of killings that made it clear the predator stalking Northwest Fort Lauderdale had returned and was escalating. By early 1980, sensing that law enforcement attention was closing in on him, he abruptly left Fort Lauderdale altogether and traveled north to Lakeland, a small city about 200 miles away, where his grandmother lived. To neighbors, it seemed like nothing more than a mentally disabled man shifting between family homes. To detectives decades later, his sudden departure coincided too neatly with the investigation tightening around him. Not long after Mosley's arrival in Lakeland, 2 local girls, Ida Eagle and Letha Mae Williams, vanished without a trace. The disappearances sent a shock through the quiet Lakeland neighborhood, where residents weren't accustomed to the level of brutality gripping Fort Lauderdale. Polk County investigators questioned residents, searched wooded areas, and canvassed the blocks around the girls' homes. Soon, all leads pointed toward one unfamiliar name, a newcomer from Broward County, a tall man with a drooping eye and a slow, vacant manner. A man whose neighbors in Fort Lauderdale later said should never have been allowed to leave the state hospital at all. Mosley was detained and questioned in the girls' disappearances, but with no bodies found, the case stalled. Deputies couldn't hold him. Detectives couldn't produce enough evidence. And as had happened so many times before, the system defaulted to the simplest explanation. This strange, mentally impaired man must not have understood the accusations. They let him walk. It wasn't until years later, after Mosley was arrested on an unrelated sexual misconduct in Fort Lauderdale and sent to prison, that the truth surfaced. While he was locked in the Broward County Jail, hunters found skeletal remains in a remote wooded area outside Lakeland. The bones were eventually identified as belonging to Ida Eagle and Letha Mae Williams. Both girls had been violated and lost their life, their bodies left to decay in the Florida heat. And still, even with the discovery, the case again slipped into limbo. Mosley was already behind bars on a separate conviction, and without modern DNA testing or a reliable timeline, Polk County did not charge him. But detectives who reviewed the case years later had no doubt. They said Mosley's brief stay in Lakeland left behind the same calling card he carried in Fort Lauderdale. Girls gone, bodies dumped near water or woods, the same combination of sexual assault and asphyxiation. One investigator summed up the truth with unsettling clarity. Wherever Mosley went, girls started disappearing. He returned to Fort Lauderdale, and on April 12, 1980, Mosley was arrested again, this time after attempting to sexually assault a young girl. The evidence held, and he was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Once Eddie Lee Mosley entered the jail, he slipped into his new role with unsettling ease. Administrators assigned him as the houseman of Cell Block C, a trustee position inside the wing reserved for the county's most volatile, unstable, and dangerous inmates. It was an environment where most men kept their backs to the wall. Eddie, however, seemed to come alive in it. He was a big guy and he was fearless, recalled Dr. John Spencer, the administrator overseeing the jail's forensic unit. He did whatever was asked of him without asking back. That quiet compliance became something far more disturbing one afternoon, when a hulking inmate barricaded himself inside a cell block, threatening to ignite the place and take everyone with him. He had a pack of matches and a reputation for following through. Deputies hesitated. Then Eddie stepped forward and volunteered to help. No one objected. He walked into the cell block alone. For a brief moment, the hall filled with violent, muffled sounds, thuds, grunts, crashes. Then the noise stopped. Eddie reappeared calmly, holding the matches in his hand. To the inmates who lived beside him, the incident was no surprise. One former cellmate, Claude Brooks, remembered Eddie with a kind of haunted clarity. He would force the new detainees to have sex with him, Brooks said. He'd grab them by the throat, lift them clean off the ground, and make them obey. Things I didn't think were right. Dr. Spencer, who spent hours observing Eddie each week during the 9 months he was housed in the unit for the criminally insane, never treated him directly as a therapist, but he saw enough. He came to view Mosley not as a schemer or a mastermind, but as something more primal. I believe that Eddie Lee Mosley, by his history and clinical presentation, poses a significant risk to society, Spencer said. He emphasized that Eddie wasn't calculating in the traditional sense. His violence was instinctive, immediate, almost mechanical. He's like a shark moving through the water, Spencer explained. When he comes across something edible, he eats it. His family eventually hired an attorney who appealed his conviction, arguing that Mosley's previous lawyer had been ineffective for failing to request a psychological evaluation. This claim gained traction, setting the stage for a new trial. The appellate court found serious flaws in the original proceedings and ultimately overturned Mosley's conviction. At the new trial, the court considered several mitigating factors and reduced his sentence. Because Mosley had already served more than 3 years, the ruling led to his release. On December 15, 1983, Eddie Lee Mosley was paroled by court order, and then the violence resumed. Quietly at first, like a familiar storm rolling back over the northwest side of the city. Barely a month after Eddie walked out of state custody, a group of neighborhood boys stumbled across the body of 35-year-old Geraldine Barfield. She lay in a patch of overgrown grass behind the Emmanuel Church of God in Christ, a place where families prayed on Sundays and children chased each other through the yard. Now it was a crime scene, marked by silence and dread. Christmas Eve in Northwest Fort Lauderdale should have been loud, music spilling out of bars, families gathering on porches, children running between houses as the night stretched on. But for 54-year-old Emma Cook, December 24, 1983, ended in a way that would shake the community and finally force detectives to confront the monster they'd been circling for years. Emma was known in the neighborhood, a quiet woman, soft-voiced, who spent evenings at Smiling Jack's Bar, a dim little place off Northwest 15th Way, where regulars came to drink, gossip, and escape the gloom outside. Witnesses later told detectives that she spent the night chatting with a tall, slow-moving man, with a drooping eye and a vacant stare. He wasn't a stranger. Everyone knew him. They'd seen him push a shopping cart down the street, rummage for cans, wander barefoot through the alleys. It was Eddie Lee Mosley. Sometime before midnight, Emma Cook left the bar with him. Christmas morning, a boy playing in the alley behind 735 Northwest 15th Way noticed something strange near the broken window of an old storage shed, what looked like someone's clothes hanging from the sill. When officers arrived, they found Emma Cook's body draped halfway through the shattered opening, caught on the jagged frame as though she had been thrown or dragged and left there without care. Her red sweater and pink blouse were still on her body, torn in places. She had been sexually assaulted and died by fatal pressure to the neck. Eddie is a suspect, but the evidence is considered inconclusive. 4 years will pass before Eddie makes his dramatic confession in May 1987 and is charged with the murder of Emma Cook. In the meantime, he is still on the streets. By May 16, 1984, Eddie Lee Mosley had once again surfaced in the crosshairs of Fort Lauderdale detectives, this time charged with sexual battery. The incident began the way so many of his encounters did. While drifting through Bass Park, Eddie struck up a conversation with a woman, inviting her into a nearby field with the promise of beer and marijuana. It was a script he had followed for nearly 15 years, one the streets had come to recognize far too well. People whispered about how he once traded small favors and scraps for companionship, and how over time, that dynamic twisted into something far more predatory. Eddie never denied meeting women or being sexually active with them. "I got a lot of women's out there," he said proudly. "We have sex. Come to my house or somewheres. No problem." Then, with childlike sincerity, he added, "If she disfuse me, I don't bother her. I do not touch her." But those who lived alongside him told a far different story. Elijah James, a crack dealer who knew Eddie from the Northwest corridors, recalled the moments when Eddie's calm exterior evaporated. "I've seen him slap them, hit them, pull their hair, put pressure on their neck," James said. "He goes off. He say, 'You going to do this. You ain't going to play with me.' He's a raging bull, and don't nobody try to stop him because most people be scared of him." The woman Eddie met in Bass Park later told detectives that he sexually assaulted her, demanding compliance and overpowering her when she resisted. Eddie was arrested again and sent for yet another psychiatric evaluation. Dr. Arnold Zager, who had examined Mosley in 1980 and 1981, offered an assessment that shocked no one in the detective bureau. "This gentleman, if released, will be a danger to society in the future, and most definitely will be prone to commit future acts of sexual battery," Zager warned. Eddie pleaded not guilty, and when the case went to trial, his defense attorney leaned heavily on the woman's history of prostitution, arguing the encounter had been consensual. The jury bought the argument. On October 25th, Eddie Lee Mosley walked out of court a free man once again. On November 10, 1984, a woman was found inside a church, this time a Better Day in Christchurch, located at 2790 NW 11th Place. Her name was 29-year-old Loretta Young Brown. The discovery was horrific. Her decomposed body was found inside the small sanctuary, slumped in a place where families gathered to pray. Parishioners who arrived that morning expecting a sermon instead found a crime scene. The church became a tomb. A month after that, on December 18, 1984, the body of 22-year-old Teresa Giles, sometimes recorded under the surname James, was found near the United Church of God at 1151 NW 27th Avenue. She had been sexually assaulted, killed by neck compression, and discarded in the same haunting pattern. When detectives realized the proximity of the site to Mosley's residence, a familiar chill ran up their spines. 8-year-old Chandra Whitehead was beat severely and assaulted in a sexual manner inside her home on April 14, 1985, and later died from her injuries at Plantation General Hospital after several days on life support. Even as the bodies accumulated, detectives still lacked the evidence needed to name a definitive killer. Eddie Mosley appeared again and again at the edges of investigations, but each time the case against him slipped through their fingers. With every dead end, pressure mounted on law enforcement to admit what residents of Northwest Fort Lauderdale had already whispered for years. Someone was hunting women in their community. At last, the Broward Sheriff's Office publicly acknowledged the truth. They were dealing with a serial predator and requested assistance from the FBI. By then, the Bureau's behavioral experts were refining what would become the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. Without knowing a single suspect's name and relying solely on crime scene reports and autopsy findings, the profilers built a behavioral portrait so precise it sent a chill through the Fort Lauderdale Homicide Division. They predicted the killer would be an unmarried black man living near the dump sites, a street-hardened school dropout with a long history of psychiatric issues, a man of low cognitive ability, wandering the streets at night, dabbling in drugs and alcohol, volatile before each attack and feigning illness afterward. They added that he would have been questioned previously and denied everything. The profile wasn't close. It was exact. It was Eddie Lee Mosley. Then another body surfaced. On February 24, 1987, the lifeless form of 24-year-old Santrail Lowe was discovered in a junkyard along Northwest 6th Place. She had been assaulted and left with signs of severe neck compression. It should have sparked an emergency investigation. Instead, the case was assigned to Detective Kevin Allen, new to homicide, and given the file because no one else wanted it. 2 weeks passed with almost no progress before Allen sought out retired Detective Doug Evans, who had spent a decade charting the violence that radiated outward from Mosley's home. Evans agreed to help. For 3 months, Allen immersed himself in the 12 unsolved killings clustered within walking distance of Mosley's residence. He spoke with psychiatrists who had treated Mosley, tracked down survivors, interviewed inmates who had served time alongside him, combed through school records, hospital logs, and old reports ignored for years. When he believed he had the full picture, he took his findings to the federal profilers. The FBI reviewed his evidence and advised exactly how to approach Mosley during questioning. Allen waited for his chance. It came on May 17, 1987, when Mosley was arrested for stealing nursery plants. Sitting across from him in the interrogation room, Allen used every tactic VICAP recommended. After 5 hours, Mosley slumped back and muttered the words Allen had been waiting years to hear. "Well, I guess they got me." Once he began talking, Mosley revealed fragments of nearly 2 decades of violence. He attempted to lie but couldn't keep his details straight. Mixing years, blending seasons, placing bodies in neighborhoods that didn't match, then accidentally revealing knowledge only the true offender would possess. By the interview's end, he admitted to the deaths of Emma Cook and Teresa Giles. Both confessions were formalized. Prosecutors prepared to bring him to trial. But the courtroom door never fully opened. As part of pre-trial procedure, Mosley underwent a psychological evaluation. Test after test placed his cognitive functioning at an extremely low level, an IQ of 51. The court ruled him legally incapable of assisting in his defense. On October 23, 1987, instead of being tried, Mosley was declared incompetent and ordered into compulsory psychiatric treatment at the Florida State Hospital. He would never again stand trial. For the rest of his life, Mosley drifted through a chain of psychiatric facilities across the state. In 2000, scientists tested old biological samples using modern DNA techniques, and the results were devastatingly clear. Mosley's genetic profile matched the assaults and deaths of multiple women: 29-year-old Loretta Young Brown, 34-year-old Vetta Turner, 13-year-old Sonia Yvette Marion, 21-year-old Terry Jean Cummings, and the cases of Emma Cook and Teresa Giles, which he had verbally admitted 2 years earlier. DNA also tied him to the April 1985 killing of 8-year-old Chandra Whitehead, a case for which another man, Frank Lee Smith, had been wrongfully convicted, condemned, and ultimately died in prison proclaiming his innocence. Only months after Smith's death did DNA reveal the truth. Mosley was also implicated in the death of 15-year-old Naomi Gamble, a case that cleared another wrongfully imprisoned man, Jerry Frank Townsend, who had confessed under pressure more than 2 decades earlier. Townsend was freed in 2001 after spending 22 years behind bars for crimes Mosley committed. By late 2001, after the DNA revelations, the Fort Lauderdale Police Department issued a warrant for Mosley's arrest. But it was already too late. Fresh psychiatric evaluations again declared him legally incompetent. Florida law prevented the state from prosecuting him, so Mosley remained protected by the same diagnosis that had saved him before, too impaired to face justice, yet too dangerous to ever be released. Over time, staff described him as cooperative, even friendly. He eventually earned placement in a low-security ward, allowed supervised trips to Walmart and community spaces, walking among the public who had no idea what he had done. By the 2010s, Mosley's health deteriorated. He was transferred to the Sunland Center in Marianna, where he spent his final years. In the spring of 2020, he contracted pneumonia, complicated by COVID-19. Eddie Lee Mosley died on May 28, 2020, at age 73. Never convicted for the majority of the lives he took. Never facing a courtroom for the terror he inflicted. His crimes exposed only when science advanced enough to outrun the system that had failed so many.